Good evening, everyone. My name is Cheryl Russell, and I am the Executive Director of Corporate, Foundation, Government, and Civic Affairs for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel dialogue entitled Redesigning the System: How Artists, Policymakers, and Practitioners are Shaping Criminal Justice Reform. Tonight's conversation marks the second year of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's partnership with the Illinois Humanities to bring together a diverse group of individuals in a dialogue about issues in the public square that no one would immediately think are impacted, shaped, or informed by art, design, and the humanities, but actually are in a meaningful way. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Alyssa Tinney, the president of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Illinois Humanities are honored to host this distinguished panelist tonight for a forward-looking conversation about criminal justice reform. This may seem an unusual topic for an art school and a cultural organization, but in fact, the realms of the arts and humanities are often where we begin to imagine transformation. Think of the criminal justice system as a work of design. Its legal, prison, and rehabilitation systems and the inequities currently present in those systems were designed by many people over time to fulfill a variety of purposes. However, neither the shape nor goals of these systems are fixed. We can redesign the criminal justice system. We can invest in programs that minimize arrests, curb recidivism. Oh, I knew I was that word just doesn't roll off the tongue. And hasten the reentry of formerly incarcerated people into productive lives as workers and citizens. Moreover, art and culture speak to the totality of human emotion, which can be restorative to those who are part of the criminal justice system and influential in changing the perspectives of those who maintain its current design. Finally, although our aim today is to speak about the future, we would be remiss not to recognize that today is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. As we engage in this discussion about the criminal justice system, we are also acknowledging the forces of racial bias inherent in that system's current design. By imagining ways to redesign that system, we honor Dr. King's legacy. Now, to introduce our panel, I am pleased to welcome to the podium our partner and colleague and friend in today's event, Illinois Humanities Executive Director, Anhil Isigiri.
Hello. Thank you very much, Alyssa. Illinois Humanities is thrilled to partner with the School of the Art Institute on tonight's panel presentation. Over 3 years ago, Illinois Humanities convened a number of stakeholders who work in the public policy arena to ask them what they thought were the most pressing public policy issues. One of the two issues, they said, was our misguided criminal justice system. Annually, the United States spends $80 billion of taxpayers' money locking up its citizens. In 2015, we committed $1.4 billion to the Department of Corrections in Illinois. We spent $241 million alone in 2015 locking up the residents of North Lawndale. Of the almost 21,000 city blocks in Chicago, the people we lock up largely live on about 850 of those blocks, concentrated in a few neighborhoods, and as you might imagine, they're primarily African American, Latino, and low-income neighborhoods. Illinois spending on incarceration is costly to all of us. Not only is there a financial cost for this ineffective system, money that we could be spending on public education, on job training, and on economic development, but there's the emotional cost to families whose parents and loved ones are locked away, the future health cost for people coming out of the system, and the social cost of taxpayers who have lost faith in our criminal justice system, then lose faith in other institutions across the board. Certainly there are better ways to invest public dollars. Yesterday, Illinois Humanities kicked off a 2-year initiative called Envisioning Justice. Envisioning Justice uses the humanities, including the arts, to engage Chicagoans in a citywide conversation about the impact of incarceration, with the goal of imagining a new criminal justice system. It will strengthen efforts to reimagine the system in ways that meet the goals of justice, accountability, safety, support, and restoration for all people impacted by crime and violence through arts education, humanities-based discussions and presentations, artist commissions, documentaries, and exhibitions. Tonight is the first public program that's part of Envisioning Justice. Chicago is actually doing amazing things to address this issue of over-incarceration. The new and first of its kind restorative justice court in North Lawndale, bond reform, just to name 2 of them. If we will satisfactorily address this issue, though, it'll require all of us as citizens to affect public policy. And we have some incredible advocates on the panel tonight. Envisioning Justice is a sprawling 2-year initiative. Your presence here shows a commitment to this issue. The website address for Envisioning Justice is in your program. Please go to the website and get on the mailing list. Envisioning Justice is an incredible collaboration of about a dozen organizations, including organizations in 7 communities that suffer from especially high rates of incarceration. None of this would be possible without an incredible partnership between Illinois Humanities and the MacArthur Foundation. Through the Safety and Justice Challenge, the MacArthur Foundation seeks to reduce over-incarceration by changing the way that America thinks about the use of jails. Envisioning Justice was created in close collaboration with the foundation, and efforts taken by Cook County to reduce rates of incarceration have received significant support, including successful efforts at bond reform and a pilot program to steer addicts and people with mental illness out of the criminal justice system. These are amazing initiatives, and we're lucky to have the MacArthur Foundation supporting them. I'm sure you'll hear about some of those efforts tonight. We've assembled, as I said, this incredible panel of leaders who are committed to addressing this issue. Moderating our discussion tonight will be Carol Bogert. Carol is the president of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit newsroom exclusively covering criminal justice issues. Since the Marshall Project launched 3 years ago, it has published more than 1,000 stories and virtually all of the issues that we'll hear discussed tonight. Many of their deep investigations are published jointly with other media organizations. You may have seen their excellent data analysis in last weekend's New York Times, disproving allegations that high levels of immigration are linked to higher crime rates. The Marshall Project is the youngest news organization ever to win the Pulitzer Prize. Carol Bogert was previously director of Human Rights Watch, an international human rights organization whose Chicago office she helped to establish. Before that, she was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek magazine in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Moscow. Bogert is a native Chicagoan. Her 97-year-old dad was supposed to be in the audience tonight, but I think he canceled at the last minute. Old people like to do that. Anyway, I think I'm getting fired tomorrow. Or maybe tonight. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Carol Bogert, who will introduce the rest of the panel.
Oh, I can't wait to tell my dad that he got a shout out. He'll be so excited. So thanks everybody for coming. It's so exciting to see an auditorium this full of people who want to talk about criminal justice. Really, for those of us who kind of labor in these difficult fields every day, it's terrific that there's public interest. Thank you so much for coming. I think it's also super exciting that we're in an art school and that we've been invited to think imaginatively and creatively about how this system could be different. A bunch of people on this panel are lawyers. But that doesn't mean they're not creative thinkers. Yeah, yay lawyers. We like lawyers, yeah. But that doesn't mean they aren't creative thinkers. And I think it's actually very moving that we're here on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, who, if nothing else, was a visionary He saw into the future about how things could be different. Let's try to do that tonight. So, having been invited to think visually, okay, this is the part where you all say, oh my God, this is like 7th grade social studies class. She's gonna make us eat our spinach. Hey, I was a social studies. But I'm sure you never made your students look at charts like this. But just for a second, think about the architecture of the criminal justice system and how huge it is. How it begins with police or the sheriff's office, the detention system, you go into the county jail, that's what Tony Preckwinkle oversees. You see a judge, you might get out on bail. At every step of the way, there are ways to get out of the system or to be pushed through it. You come before somebody from Kim Fox's office who makes a decision about whether to file charges or to drop charges. You come eventually before a judge, or you may not. First of all, how many of y'all have some degree of knowledge about the criminal justice system because you watch Law and Order, the TV show? How many of you have watched Law and Order? Okay, I've spent many happy hours watching Law and Order. Okay, click on the part of your brain that knows something about the criminal justice system from Law and Order and move it to the trash bin. That television show has done more to propagate myths about how the system works than probably any other single cultural artifact in our country. Most cases don't go to trial. They're plea bargained. Some cases may be diverted out of the system, may go to a restorative justice initiative, about which I hope we'll hear a little bit more. The incarceration system is run by the Illinois Department of Corrections. Supervision, parole, these are all huge bureaucracies. And all of them have gotten much bigger just in the last couple of decades, making the criminal justice system, as Angel explained, one of the most explosively expensive and wasteful parts of our society. And it's for that reason that we're gathered tonight to try to think about how to do this differently. Now, I've been asked to introduce the panel, and I was given a very nice long introduction, but I think you all have programs and you mostly know who these people are. This is Kim Fox, she's your state's attorney. This is Tony Preckwinkle, she's the Cook County Board President. This is Judge Ruben Castillo, an eminent federal judge in the Northern District. Sarah is a fantastic artist, and Jeff works at the Fifth Third Bank and cares a lot about these issues. Let's start by inviting Kim, since you're immediately on my left, to tell us what is your vision of how the criminal justice system should be redesigned?
Sure. First, thank you for having me. I think it's great to have the graph behind me to show what it is that we do. I think it's important that even as you look at this, when we talk about crime and violence, that the state's attorney's office, the prosecutor's office, which generally is the gatekeeper of who enters into the justice system, police arrest, prosecutors, the state's attorney's office charges. We decide if the charge will continue or not. We decide if you can go to a diversion program or not. And so there's a tremendous amount of weight that comes with being a prosecutor in Cook County and elsewhere. I think where we have to think about and imagine how we can do this differently is a realization that once you get to the prosecutor's office, it's after a long line of things have happened before. People start with the crime that has gotten you arrested or brought to our attention, but what we know all too often of the people who use our systems is that we can identify who will darken our doorstep years before. When we talk about issues around drug addiction and the fact that in Cook County, the number one charge that is direct filed from police are drug possession charges. What we know when we talk about the opioid crisis is that we have people with serious addiction issues in our country, in our county, and our response has not been to deal with addiction issues in the appropriate place, which is in the public health sphere, but we deal with them in the criminal justice sphere. And so, yes, once you find someone who has drugs in their pocket and you bring them to me, there are choices that I have to make. But the question that I have is, why do I have to make those choices when we know fundamentally that I am not the person to make that decision, that I am not equipped? That when we talk about mental health, when we realize that we have a lot of people who are struggling with mental health issues, who are also dependent on drugs, or who also have co-issues that are associated with that, and we don't have the resources in community to deal with mental health treatment for a variety of reasons, but particularly in communities of color, and particularly in poor communities. And when someone presents with those issues that is coupled with criminal behavior, again, they're at our doorstep. When I talk about juvenile justice, we have one of the largest juvenile centers in the country. When we look at the young people who come through our detention center, many of those kids, and I used to be a representative of children in the foster care system, have had some form of trauma or abuse, or have come through our systems, whether through the child protection system, or we've seen them in schools, exhibiting behaviors as a result of the environments around them, where we have some level of sympathy and empathy because they're children who can't control what's around them until the moment that they break into a car. And then we've decided that the place that we deal with that and their trauma and the things that they bring are at the state's attorney's office, or police and prosecution. So for me, I think reimagining justice is really acknowledging the hard truths that we know about the people who enter into our systems, and not relegating the response simply to a system that is designed to bring people in, with the knowledge that most people who come through the criminal justice system do not come out better for it. And we have to be honest about that. And I say that as a prosecutor, that there's this false notion that we have of safety in jails, that if somehow we lock up more people, then we will fundamentally be safer. And what my colleagues will tell you is that we see often the same people over and over again. We see people who've come out of the system, and we can count the number of times that they've been incarcerated. We can look at their neighborhoods and communities, as Angel pointed out, and see the devastation that has occurred as a result of the use of incarceration, and not the growth or the thriving of those communities as a result of how we've intervened. So reimagining means thinking prevention, thinking of ways that I am not the gatekeeper of the mental health system, of the public health system, of the abuse or child welfare system, where those services and those solutions are based in community and not in jails.
Thank you. President Breckhogan, can you tell us in 3 minutes how you would redesign the system?
Good evening.
Good evening. You're on. You're on.
Okay, good. So let me begin the way I usually begin. So I'm a history teacher. Context is important to me. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the people in the entire world who are incarcerated. 5% of the population and 25% of the people in the entire world who are in prison. And what I usually say is, unless you believe that people in the United States are somehow more inclined to be criminals than people elsewhere in the world, we're doing things terribly wrong. And if you look a little deeper, we incarcerate white people at about the same rate that people are incarcerated in Europe. The reason we have so many people in our jails and prisons is we incarcerate black and brown people in just astronomical numbers. Astronomical numbers. In our county jail, it's not a prison, it's a jail. In our county jail, 86% of the people are black and brown. Now that's in a county where 25% of the people are Latino and 25% of the people are African American. So 50% of the population is black and brown, but 86% of the people in the jail are black and brown. 86%. What I usually say is the jails in this country, jails and prisons, grind up black and brown people. This has always been profoundly disturbing to me, and I'm grateful to the people of Cook County that they've given me the opportunity in the last 8 years, and now 4 more, to try to address this challenge. And before I go any further, let me acknowledge the people to my right and left. Kim Fox, as many of you know, was my chief of staff for several years before she took on her present challenge. And she really encouraged me and my staff to look not only at our internal challenges within the county, but to try to figure out how we could have an impact at the statewide level. And it's frankly as a result of her prodding that we went to Springfield and tried to work on criminal justice reform both for juveniles and adults. I will tell you that we had much more luck on the juvenile side than we have on the adult side. And we've made tremendous progress there, and it was at her instigation. First of all, trying to ensure that young people stayed in the juvenile system as long as possible. It was called Raise the Age campaign, and it had been kind of bubbling for a very long time, and we were able to achieve some success there. Raise the age to 17. Young people stay in the juvenile justice system until their 18th birthday. So that was the first thing we did. Kim is going to help me in case I forget one. Then we reduced the number of young people who automatically were sent to adult court, reduced the number of crimes that would automatically send juveniles to the adult courts, because the adult courts are focused on punishment and the juvenile courts are focused on rehabilitation. We eliminated the mandatory 5-year probation for juvenile offenders so that the probation period is at the discretion of a judge. Because what was happening is young people would serve their time or whatever for their offense, but then they would be on probation for 5 years, and some petty offense like curfew violation would throw them back into the criminal justice system. So we eliminated mandatory 5-year probation. And then last year, we were able to provide for automatic expungement for most juvenile records. And that's a real godsend, because of every 1,000 young people in Illinois, less than 1% got their records expunged, because we created such a complicated, difficult system that young people were not able to achieve expungement of their juvenile records. So I'm very grateful to Kim Fox for her work, not only as my chief of staff, but for the prodding to look at the state level and to try to figure out how we could be more impactful there. On my left is a federal judge who regularly talks about the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. God bless him. I wish that more of our judges would talk about the fact that their courtrooms are full of black and brown people and the obvious terrible inequity of that. But I won't say Judge Castillo is alone in this. He may know of other colleagues, but he's the one who I hear and see talking about this issue all the time, so God bless him. What we focused on in Cook County is bond court, because it's the portal into the criminal justice system. We've worked with all the stakeholders, not only Kim, but the public defender, Amy Campanelli, Sheriff Dart, Circuit Court Clerk Brown, Chief Judge Evans, trying to make bond court fair. And what we've done is basically reversed the statistics about being released on your own recognizance and electronic monitoring and getting a cash bond. We've dramatically reduced reliance on cash bonds. And as a result, the jail population in the last, 4 years? 4 years has been reduced 40%. And you have to understand, the overwhelming majority of the people in our jail when we started this were people accused of nonviolent crimes. They were not accused of murder or rape or robbery. They were accused of low-level drug offenses, prostitution, shoplifting, the things people do to get money for their drugs, not paying their child support, not paying their traffic tickets. Our judges our jails are poorhouses. So I should stop because I'm getting the sign that I've used up my 3 minutes. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk to the general public about the challenges we face in criminal justice, because it's an unacknowledged nightmare in this country.
I want to remind the audience that you all should be thinking about your question and writing it down on the little piece of paper that I think you were given, because later somebody's going to come by and pick it up, and we're going to try to answer it if we have enough time, which is why we're going to ask Judge Castillo to try to stick to 3 minutes. Thank you.
We'll try.
I didn't do very well.
It's hard to keep judges to 3 minutes. First of all, I certainly agree with everything that's been said so far. I agree with President Preckwinkle. We're mutual fans. We're over-incarcerating too many people, and too many are minorities, Hispanics and African Americans. Why is that? Well, too often that criminal justice system that you saw depicted is like a giant vacuum cleaner that just picks up people out of their community, deposits them in state or federal prisons. That's why we have such an over-incarceration rate. And the fact is, you and I are paying for that. So it costs as much to keep someone in the state pen as it costs to send your child to Penn State, $50,000 a year. And are we making good decisions about that? The easy answer is no, because I can tell you from having served on the United States Sentencing Commission, we're now going the other way. That is reducing some of these lengthy, ridiculous sentences. And there's no great crime wave that's occurring in the United States, and nobody's written about that. And it really is appalling. Nobody's writing about the fact that now that more people are out at the Cook County Jail free on bond, there's no great crime wave occurring in Cook County because these people are free pending bond. Instead, they have a better chance of being employed, better chance at making good decisions about what they're going to do with regard to their case, and not being pressed into entering into guilty pleas that maybe shouldn't be occurring. Because when you're detained pending trial, it is easy to accept some type of plea agreement that says you will get out of jail with time served, even if you might not be guilty. I'm very proud of the fact that in federal court, unlike what might be the perception, most of our people are free on bond pending trial. We have a 65% release rate. Why is that? Because we have the luxury of having less cases at the federal system, so we're making more nuanced decisions. So instead of having the giant vacuum cleaner, what I've been advocating for all my time in the criminal justice system, which I should say started out in bond court and state court. I was a kid, grew up in Chicago. I started out at 26 in California in the state system, working my way through college, Loyola, by the way, and Northwestern. And I learned a lot through that. And what we need to do is be more nuanced. So instead of having that giant vacuum cleaner, what I would like us to have are surgical centers where we're making surgery type decisions. Some people need extensive surgery, some people don't. But some people can be patched up and put back into the community, and everyone, no matter how much time they serve in prison, needs help to re-enter into their communities. It's not easy when you get out of prison, whether or not you serve 1 year, 2 years, or 20, to come back out and regain employment, to regain your family, and to make it. It's real easy to collapse, and that's why we have a high recidivism rate, because we don't put enough effort into the reentry part of it. And so our court has started multiple reentry court programs to help prisoners who have been in jail. And I will tell you, quite frankly, tomorrow morning at 8:30 in the morning, I will be sitting right next to former federal prisoners talking about what type of decisions they're making, how they're interacting with their families, they can get jobs, and boy, we need to really get people back on their feet, because that makes our community stronger. Or else all we're doing is paying $50,000 a year to incarcerate someone and dooming them to failure once they get out, because we're putting a big stigma on them of, you're a felon, you can't be employed, you can't vote, and what do you think they're going to do when they're frustrated? It's real easy to then go back into the criminal justice system. So we need to end the cycle.
Thank you, Judge Castillo. I'm going to make sure that you get the web address of the Marshall Project so that you're aware that we are writing about the fact that crime is at 40-year historic lows in this country. Sarah Ross, you're running an extremely innovative art program inside Statesville Prison, is that right? Tell us a little bit how you reimagine the system in 3 minutes.
That's right. I'm going to do this 3 minutes and three points that I wanted to bring up. I mean, there's so many ways, and I have to say that I have the luxury maybe of not being in the same trenches that these folks are, that I'm not trying to move tiny pieces of policy or big pieces of policy to make these changes. So, but I work with people who are at Stateville Prison and have really long prison sentences. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is redesigning the system means looking at people who have long-term sentences and addressing the harm and violent crimes that they might have caused. I think about this a lot because even tomorrow, if we let out everybody who has a nonviolent drug offense in the United States, we would still have mass incarceration at 700,000 people or more. And for sure, the prison population would be more Black and brown, exposing the incredible disparities at sentencing that people face. So I think that focusing on nonviolent drug offenses is really important reform move at the outset, but it also needs to be remembered that it leaves out about half of the prison population, and we ultimately need to address that harm because we need to figure out how to hold people accountable without permanently condemning them to what people at Stateville say is a living grave. So we have to think about how we live with grief and how do we heal trauma. I think that would be an important part of redesigning the system. I also think a lot about where our resources go. This is a map of the $1 Million Blocks project that was developed by the Spatial Design Lab out of Columbia and then adopted in many cities across the United States. And this was done here in Chicago by Ryan Holland and Dan Cooper, who are graduate students at UIC, and they have a book coming out about it. They look at something what they call concentrated punishment at the specific neighborhoods in Chicago that really bear the brunt of over-incarceration and policing. And here it's an interactive map that you can go to online when you're done here tonight. And you can scroll over your own neighborhood and look at how much money is spent on your block for incarceration. And if Dan or Ryan are in the audience, they could correct me, but I think it's only for state incarceration, not even for the money that's spent at the Cook County level. And some blocks constitute more than $1 million per block. So it asks, it just begs this question about how much money is being funneled into poor Black and brown neighborhoods, and in what form. Lots of money is funneled. Lots of our social resources are funneled into those neighborhoods, but only in the form of policing and punishment. In fact, right now there's a proposal for a $95 million police academy in Austin, and young people are organizing to say, no, we want that money for all kinds of other imaginative things like amazing schooling, conflict resolution services. So there's ways that we can rethink about where our resources go. In particular, in Illinois, spending on corrections grew by 96% between 1985 and 2015, while spending on higher education declined 21% in that same time. And that's statistics from the Alliance of Safety and Justice. And finally, I'll just say quickly, or not quickly, but finally I'll say that I think that leadership from formerly incarcerated people and family members of incarcerated people is really critical. And also leadership from people inside, actually, I think is critical. I work with people in prison who are writing legal briefs all the time. They impact legislation from in prison. In fact, there's a group of people at Stateville right now that are really thinking critically about how to bring back parole in Illinois. We don't have a parole board that releases people. People have determinate sentences. So when you get 80 years, you have to do all 80 years. So it means people are just stuck in the time that they were incarcerated, and oftentimes they're incarcerated when they were young and missed out on the reforms that are now in place. So I think leadership from people who are both inside but also outside. Formerly incarcerated people are doing amazing things that are shaping the society that we live in now. They're doing ban the box campaigns for higher education, the box on application to get in college, ban the box and employment, restoring voter rights. So I think that that's really important. And then importantly, family members are doing amazing work. Family members all over this city are organizing other family members to go visit people in prison, to take their children to visit people in their parents in prison. Family members are going to Springfield and advocating for reform. So I think leadership from people who are impacted by these systems in direct ways has to be part of the vision of redesign. So I actually kind kind of think we know what we need to do to change the system, but we don't really have the political will yet to do it. So maybe this conversation and the kind of culture we build out of it will help build that political will.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Jeff Korzenik from the Fifth Third Bank, I think you're really representing a kind of a different voice on this panel, a voice from the business community. Tell us why you're here and why you care about this issue and how you imagine the criminal justice system being different.
Sure, thank you very much. And Judge, if you think it's hard keeping a judge to 3 minutes, try an economist. I'm going to share with you 3 slides that I share with thousands of business leaders around the country as I speak. These 3 slides embody how I envision change, and that change is much greater engagement of the business community. So we could pull up the first graph. This is, and I apologize if you're not a chart person, bear with me here. This is a chart of the rate of unemployment in the United States going back to 1948. It goes up, it goes down, goes up following in recessions, goes down in recoveries. The vertical gray bars are periods of recession. So the starting point for engagement of the business community is to help them understand what's at stake if we don't maximize our resources in the workforce. And what you'll see in this chart is when the unemployment rate gets very low, as it is right now, sooner or later a recession follows. You simply run out of room to grow. So what's the cost of failure to grow? Well, we're a $19 trillion GDP economy. Even very conservatively, we're growing at 2% a year. So if you give up a year of growth, that's $380 billion. And as I say to business leaders, not someone else's $380 billion, all of our $380 billion. And by most estimates, we are missing out of the labor force somewhere between 1 and 2 years worth of labor to grow. So the second slide is where I ask business leaders to think differently about the population that has been touched by the criminal justice system. And these are different measures of who's been touched. It goes from the left-hand side, the number of people who are currently incarcerated. You add up, moving to the right, you add to the next column those who are on probation or parole. You get to 7 million. The number that I'd like to hone in on is that the third one, that's 19 million. That's the number of people with felony convictions in the United States. And some are incarcerated. Yes, some are in the labor force. But I would argue, and I've never had anyone really challenge this, that of those 19 million, many of them are not in the labor force, and those who are in the labor force are underutilized. And that we should think of this population not as a cost, but as a potential contributor to society. Just for reference, the number on the right is the one you hear most often, 70 million people touched by the criminal justice system. It's a sprawling number. The 19 million with felony convictions is probably the number we should be focused on. So if we have the business community attuned to the cost of not doing anything, $380 billion for every year of growth we give up, if you have, and we need incidentally beyond demographics and immigration, we need about 1.25 million new entrants to the labor force, and there's 19 million people who are largely underutilized out there. That's not a cost, that's not a problem, that's an opportunity. And this opportunity takes a form, if we switch to the next slide. We've studied at Fifth Third a number of pioneering businesses across the country that have taken the step and have actually focused on reentry. A significant portion of their labor force has come out of incarceration. And what was remarkable to me in studying this is no matter the geography, no matter the industry, it all looks similar. And it involves a partnership between the business community, understanding the opportunity, the nonprofit community, supporting the opportunity. Here in Chicago, we have fantastic workforce development nonprofits that do this, and also recognition of government's role in this. And so when I'm asked to envision what it could be, it's a ecosystem where all 3 stakeholders, government, nonprofits, and business, understand their roles and what can be done here to make it better and respect the perspective of each of the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think a number of you made reference to, in essence, the investment in things outside the criminal justice system. The white space outside of the criminal justice system is underinvested to deal with problems that have been shunted to the criminal justice system to solve. How do we go about, now, as you're all aware, there is a fair amount of bipartisan support for criminal justice reform in this country. There is a strong voice on the right in the Republican Party. It may not be always the dominant voice, but it's there. Some of it's on moral grounds, but some of it's on economic grounds, that we're spending too much on prisons, on courts, on rehabilitation. In fact, if we redesign the system in the way that some of you have suggested, we'll be spending that money on other things. President Preckwinkle, when you think about this, you're responsible also for a large part of the health spending in this county. Are we going to be able to save money in the redesign of the criminal justice system, or are we going to be redeploying it to things like mental health, as State's Attorney Fox mentioned, or other important parts of our society that are underinvested at the moment?
Well, let me respond in several ways. First of all, when I was first elected, a delegation from Thresholds, which is an organization that serves those who struggle with mental illness, came to see me and they said, you should understand that on any given day, a quarter to a third of your population in the jail struggles with mental illness, substance abuse. They sometimes call it dual diagnosis. People take illicit drugs to relieve their anxiety or calm the voices in their head. So that's one part of it. Large numbers of people who struggle with mental illness end up in our criminal justice system, which of course is absolutely the wrong place for them. We have a health system, and what we started doing when we created County Care, which is our Medicaid expansion program, is enrolling people in the jail in county care so that they would have access to physical health services and behavioral health services when they got out. And we've now enrolled 16,000 people in the jail so that when they leave, they have a medical home and access to behavioral health services. And I think that is one of the ways in which we're struggling to deal with the recidivism issues, because if people don't have particularly their behavioral health challenges addressed, they're much more likely to return to jail. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is when I came into office, we started making modest investments in anti-violence initiatives, so violence prevention, restorative justice, anti-recidivism initiatives. So that's the three areas of investment in community organizations that are trying to meet those challenges in their neighborhoods. And we've spent now about $17 million over the last, whatever it is, 7 years. We need to invest a lot more in that, because basically we run the courts and the jails and spend hundreds of millions every year on that. And hopefully as we drive the jail population down, we can use some of the resources that previously went into detaining people for the kind of initiatives I just spoke about: violence prevention, restorative justice, anti-recidivism efforts. So through our health system, we're trying to provide care for people which will help them address the challenges they face. We're trying to invest in community organizations that support efforts to reduce the pipeline into the jail and to help people who are returning citizens. So those are the things we're doing right off the bat. But I will say, to go back to your point, I think this is a really hopeful time in terms of criminal justice reform, because the people who are concerned about fiscal responsibility and the incredible amounts of money we spend on detaining and incarcerating people have made common cause with the bleeding hearts, who say that there's just terrible injustice here. And so the people who are focused on fiscal responsibility and the people who are focused on social injustice have made common cause in criminal justice reform.
I guess my fear is just that when the people who want to cut costs realize that the bleeding hearts actually want to keep spending money, but just in other places, that's going to be a political issue that people like you are going to have to solve.
It will continue to be a challenge. I think we have to say that investments in things like violence prevention, anti-recidivism, restorative justice reduce the long-term investments that you'd have to make in the jails and prisons. So you have to make a sort of cost-benefit analysis for them. Yeah.
They also make communities safer. It's not even just that they're not in jail. I mean, what we have to reckon with is that when you look at communities that are healthy and thriving, where there's economic investment, where there's access to resources, whether it's grocery stores or mental health, public health, you tend to see lesser incidences of violence, right? What we've done is we've equated violence with race and not with investment, with opportunity. And so when you invest outside of the system, when you invest in neighborhoods, when you invest in those resources, those communities tend to be safer. And to the point that was just made, that the ability to then contribute to the tax base, the ability to then contribute to the shared economy, where you are not a cost, but you are actually a contributor, I think benefits us all the same. So I do understand that worry, but I think what we are talking about is not just deflection from the justice system, but investment in healthy, thriving communities. And that equates with safety. I think we have too often lost in the conversation about reform, that this isn't reform for reform's sake. As someone who might be more on the bleeding heart side, even as a prosecutor, it's about safety. I mean, I grew up I talk about often, I grew up in public housing, I grew up in Cabrini, I grew up the child of a single parent, the trauma, the things that we are talking about. And I know that the outcomes are better for people who don't have those barriers. But I also know that there is an overrepresentation of people who come from those neighborhoods in our justice system, and they are more likely to be victims of violent crime. And so when we talk about that, when we talk about violent crime, when we talk about escalating gun violence in our city and the concentrated neighborhoods they're in, it's not because those people are more prone to violence. If you look at the deficits of investment in those communities and ask ourselves what we know better, why we aren't investing in those neighborhoods that we're spending $1 million on incarceration while children are literally dying in the streets, I think it doesn't make you fall on one side of the spectrum of you care about money or you care about people. There's a real humanity to this work that requires us to meaningfully invest outside of our jail systems when we stop the fallacy, stop the lie that it is prisons that are keeping us safer and not healthy, safety communities.
Let me just add as a teacher, whenever I talk about the challenges that our communities face, the communities in which there are millions of dollars invested in imprisoning people, are communities, if you look at them, that have high levels of unemployment, low levels of literacy, high levels of poverty, either closed schools or poorly performing schools. Those communities are profoundly disinvested in. And unless we look at them holistically and not just from the perspective of investments in police and policing, we're making a terrible mistake, because those communities will continue to bubble up very challenged people unless we address the broader spectrum of challenges that those communities face. And as I said, these are our poorest black and brown neighborhoods. Those are the $1 million blocks.
Jeff, you use the language of investment, of course, in the business world. I noticed that you make an entirely practical argument.
Yes.
Your slides are making a practical argument. Does the moral argument resonate with your audiences?
It does, but as a secondary consideration. And because realistically, most of the hiring in this country is done not by large corporations, but by small businesses. Something like this whole expansion, 70% or so of all the hiring, net new jobs created were companies under 500 workers, and most of it was under 100 workers. So they live much closer to the edge, they don't have the vast resources, yet even at that level, we see when this model of re-entry that's been developed by these pioneering companies is followed, they make the investments. They don't necessarily rely on government, they do tend to partner with nonprofits. So for example, I just spoke to a CEO of a printing company in Ohio who hired a life coach. There's a group of 16 businesses in Western Michigan which have banded together to support what we would think of, many of you have at your places of work, an employee assistance program, a support network, and it's paid for by these 16 companies. And each time we see this model being repeated, and they do it not out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, I think these are good people who took the step to try this, but ultimately it supports their employees in meaningful ways, and it reduces turnover, which is a huge business expense. And we've also seen when this model is followed that the employees, people who've come out of incarceration or other issues, are not just equal employees, they actually tend to be more dedicated, and there's some evidence that there's a lot of evidence that they're lower turnover, more loyal, and there's some evidence that they're also more productive.
I would second that. From working in our reentry program, these are exceptional employees because they're so grateful to be given an opportunity that they will run through a brick wall for you. So, and I agree, what our country needs is more treatment, both for addiction problems. We have to recognize, first of all, as someone who has fought in the drug war as a prosecutor and now has sentenced people, we've lost the drug war. That's his point of fact. In 40 years, there's still the use of drugs is the same, the price of drugs is the same. So if the price remains the same after 40 years, you're losing, because if we were winning, the price of drugs would be up and demand would have gone down. Neither of those two things have changed. The drugs are just as available as they were in 1970, if not more so. All that's happening is we have different type of drugs that are more readily available. So we need to commit more money to treatment. We need to commit more money to mental health treatment. And we need to have saner, emphasize this, saner gun regulations in this country.
Ask you about investing in the judiciary. You mentioned that as a federal judge, you have the relative luxury of actually some time to consider the cases that come before you. Of course, many judges in the system do not. It's a conveyor belt that passes through their eye. They have to make very quick decisions. Do we need to have fewer people coming before judges because Kim Foxx or Tony Preckwinkle has managed to divert them out of the system? Or do we actually need to have a more robust court system with more people and more time to think?
My point of view is you need custom decisions to be made. These are individual people. They need individual attention. We cannot have one-size-fits-all mandatory sentences. They just don't work. They don't work for anyone. It wouldn't be fair for your children if you said, well, everybody that does this is going to get 100 days of detention, no matter what, no exceptions. That's not a fair world. You need to be able to be much more nuanced than that. Those type of decisions are ripe with a lot of problems. And then as someone who served on a sentencing commission, I could show you study after study that tells you there's no big difference in sentencing somebody to 8 years than 6 years. So then why, as a society, are we sentencing somebody to 2 extra years at $50,000 a year each year when there's no dramatic difference in the recidivism rate? So what are we getting in return? We're just taking that individual away from their family, a father away from their children, a spouse away from their spouse for 2 extra years with no net return. Those are bad business decisions, bad moral decisions. They have consequences, and those children suffer. So we need to just be smarter about how we're going to go after real crime and make more nuanced decisions. The right people, with time, if judges have enough time, they'll send the right people to jail for the right amount of time. But if we're in this one-size-fits-all or rush system, you're going to end up with bad results.
Sarah, how can we make the voices of incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, or even currently incarcerated people in this debate more heard? This is something that you've done through teaching of art in the prison system, but literally those are people who are locked away. They don't have a voice. How can we make their voice heard?
Well, the prison system is structurally designed to isolate and segregate. And so
the work that we do is this tiny, tiny, tiny drop in a huge system. And it's like sort of slowly eking, the writing and the artwork, through internal affairs to make sure it doesn't have a star that could look like that star, but it's not that star, in order to get out of prison. And so I think that's, working in the prison system itself is full of compromises, because there's a lot of censorship, and that's how they run, and that's the deal you make doing that work. But nonetheless, there's a handful of programs around the country, a handful of activities happening in jails and prisons in the form of higher education in prison, and art and creative practices in prison. And these are, some few instances where we do this work and we bring the work out and make it be part of a conversation. So when we, several years ago, I started a project called Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project. We work at Stateville. We teach 13 classes a year. We partner with the Poetry Foundation and a bunch of universities and colleges around the city, and we always teach art and poetry. And then we also teach, African American studies or Latino studies or art history or, a whole range of other classes. And in those classes, we make it a priority for folks who want to make work that will be presented on the outside. And the goal is really to try to make that wall a little bit more permeable, even just for a minute. And so we have exhibitions, and then part of those exhibitions are to put that work into dialogue, so that while people are locked up, they can't be there. Their work can be there, and that is the basis of a conversation about the concerns of people inside. And a lot of times that's about things like parenting. Like, what does it look like to parent in a visiting room for 25 years? I mean, people are parents. Or some of those conversations are about, the project we're doing right now is around long-term sentencing, and it's about the fear of dying in prison. One man wrote this story that we're working on an animation project that will be animated by hand-drawn animation, and he had his sister buy a funeral plan for him because he was afraid to die in prison and have his body buried in prison because he didn't want, or to be buried in the prison burial ground because he didn't want to die. He didn't want to be buried. He didn't want to be locked up in death. And so, these are really important things to think about when we actually make sentencing policy. And so we try to put that work in dialogue with movements that are happening in the city and conversations that are happening at the policy level.
Education is, of course, one of the things that is most likely to reduce recidivism, the other thing being age. People age out of crime. Jeff, the business community, if they're interested in employing people in this workforce, are they also interested in investing in their education?
They are. And once you turn the corner and have businesses understand that the people behind bars are their potential employees, it starts to change. Again, I'll go back to a company that we've spoken to. They're an envelope maker. They put a printing press in a local correctional facility. They're not doing prison labor, but they're doing training there. And actually one of their employees, seasoned employees, made a mistake and is behind bars in that facility. He's a trainer. And they're actually sending their people in. So they'll have people trained coming out, and they have a shortage of workers. I also, just as a real quick aside, I can't stress how important I think the arts are to reducing those barriers. And it goes in a couple of ways. I mean, for instance, I know of only one play. It was performed by the American Theater Company a couple of years ago that talks about, that humanizes the ex-offender and goes through re-entry. We need more of that. I'm privileged to serve on the board of the Harris Theater. The Harris, I was talking about this issue with their leadership. Their CEO, Patricia Barreto, said, we can do better, we can hire someone. So they've partnered with Cara, one of the great workforce development companies. They just hired their first person who needed a second chance. They are helped gather business clothes for Cara's clothing drive, so people have professional clothes. And then finally, at Cara, if you've been out in the workforce for a full year, you're considered a graduate. The Harris is working to help them build that sense of community by setting aside blocks of tickets at performances for free to Cara graduates. The arts can play a much bigger role.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I was talking with a formerly incarcerated friend the other day, and he said, you remember how at a certain point gay characters started popping up on TV? Like they weren't necessarily the central character, they just happened to be gay and they were like the friend or whatever. How come you never see people who have a friend and they're just formerly incarcerated? It's just like one of the things that is a characteristic of somebody who might be a character on a TV show. And I said to him, well, why don't you go out to Hollywood and talk to some script writers about that, actually. Okay, I sense a great degree of agreement on our panel. So I would like us to come back to the idea that actually this is hard. If it were easy to do, it would already have happened. Y'all in the audience seem to be kind of on the side of the reformers here on the panel, and you're clapping in such a nice way, and thank you for your support. But let's talk a little bit for a minute about why it's so hard and how it can change, and I'm going to ask you to do that, Kim Fox, because you are trying to change the culture of your office to a certain degree. You're asking prosecutors to think about things like mitigation, which is the way a defense lawyer thinks, and to think about the broader context of crime. How can we change the culture?
I think so I struggle with this because I think it's not even just our office, it's the public. When you hear Sarah talk about, that this is someone planning a funeral, that someone is a father, that someone cares about the arts. We don't, in our criminal justice system, when we talk about humanizing people, it hurts my feelings to hear that, because I work in a system that is all about humans, but we do not treat them with any manner of humanity in our processes. And that's not just as prosecutors, it's a business that the criminal justice system is, and we talk about statistics and we talk about processes, but not people. And I think the hardest part is we are talking about Black people, we are talking about Latinos, we are talking about poor people, we are talking about disenfranchised, and we would rather believe that there are bad people than bad systems. That we would rather believe that if they didn't do that, why should we give art programs to people in prison? They made bad choices. My kid doesn't have art programming at their school. Why would we do that? Why should I care about whether someone has a child? They made a choice, and so why should we pay for their choices? These are real conversations that aren't just in prosecutors' offices. They're at dinner tables at home, that we have decided that our justice system are good people versus bad people. And the nuances of, well, we know people who skirted past the justice system who turned out to be great people, or who came out of the justice system who were good people. And we don't really talk about that because the security that we have of we're not one of them allows us to do bad things to people. And that's why it's hard, because I think if you only talk about processes, if you only talk about, well, if prosecutors did this and defense attorneys did this, and not talk about us as a country, if we're talking about Martin Luther King, if we're not being honest, that the use of incarceration on Black people and Latinos, on poor people, is a form of social control. If we don't talk about what happens in neighborhoods and redlining and underinvestment in education, if we don't talk about the conditions in communities where folks are living, where violence is high, it's not about those people doing bad things, then we don't own it. And then it becomes kooky people like the panel saying, well, we have to reimagine. The political will comes from this mindset that people in positions of leadership have, that, well, you should have done better. And instead of saying our systems have failed, there's no other business model where you can have a failure rate like our criminal justice system and like sit back and feel good about yourself. I don't feel good about it at all. And for my prosecutor, we go into this work because we care about communities, but we can't believe that we're heroes. We're not coming to save people, right? I've been in those neighborhoods. People don't want us to save them. They want us to value them. And then we work in support of them. And that means that we don't talk about the thems. We don't use the dialect that we think that they talk in. We don't talk about how we're mad that they're ungrateful, that we're doing our jobs. And I get very passionate about this because it's such an honor and a privilege, but I've worn multiple hats. And so occupying this job for the last 15 months is coupled with having grown up in these neighborhoods, I know people who've been incarcerated. We have Thanksgiving dinners together. I know people who have been addicted to drugs, who have been prostitutes. They've babysat my children because it's my cousin. And so the familiarity of all of this to me and working in a system that refuses to acknowledge the humanity of folks allows for us to continue to invest in bad policy because we can distance ourselves. That's why it's hard, because if we're being honest, we don't care about these people because they are largely poor, they are largely Black, and they are largely Latino.
Okay, everybody needs to be writing down their questions and passing them down to people who will collect the cards. If you wouldn't mind writing in big letters, because I didn't bring my reading glasses. Thank you so much. I'm an old person. Let's ask one more hard question. I want to ask it of you, Tony Preckwinkle. And that's, Sarah alluded to it earlier, violent offenders. How far can we get with the nonviolent drug offenders? And how much do we have to have uncomfortable conversations about people who are responsible for violence in order really to make a dent in mass incarceration?
Well, I guess I would start the discussion about uncomfortable conversations in a slightly different place, and just piggyback on what Kim was saying. You know, if we're going to really deal with the challenges this country faces regarding mass incarceration, we have to have difficult conversations about race and class in this country. And those conversations make a lot of people uncomfortable, and they don't happen often enough. And you know, I've always felt that it was my responsibility, given my position and what the legacy missions of the county in public health and public safety, to talk about racism, to talk about the way in which this country treats poor people, that our jails are poorhouses at the intersection of racism and poverty. And if people in leadership positions don't talk about that, don't share that reality with their constituents, we're going to have real trouble dealing with the consequences. So I feel a special obligation to talk always about racism, to talk always about the impacts of poverty. You know, so I'm old enough to have lived through the 60s, and one of my favorite songs, one of the lines was, "There but for fortune go you or I." And, you know, those of us who did not grow up in the profoundly difficult environments that many people in the city of Chicago and the county of Cook face have to understand the extent of our privilege, and that it's, you know, an accident of the womb that we're where we are, and that others, you know, face different and more profound challenges. And unless we can call upon empathy in our larger population, and get people to understand that that their privilege is an accident of birth in most cases, and that others, through the accident of birth, find themselves in neighborhoods that struggle profoundly, you know, we're not going to be able to address the problems. As long as it's other people and them, you know, we're not going to be able to invest the money either in the individuals or the communities that it's going to take to turn things around. And that's, I continue to see that as a real challenge. It's just too easy to dismiss people who are caught up in our criminal justice system, and as Kim says, you know, they're people who made bad choices and it's all their fault, and not to acknowledge the bitter realities that face people in many of these neighborhoods.
Does anybody on the panel have a good idea about how to actually have these conversations? How, in what? Okay.
You just go to events like this and say it.
That's a start. That's a start.
I'll jump in. You know, one of the models that I've seen, we focus on, you know, full-time employment, but also transitional employment. And one of the things that I think has been done a wonderful job at humanizing, and would be a great thing to see in Chicago, is in a couple of cities, There are culinary training programs that have a restaurant attached that are staffed by ex-offenders. One of the leaders here is in Cleveland, Edwin's Leadership Institute and Restaurant. They put 201 people through it to be in their 6-month culinary training program. You had to have been incarcerated. They've been at it 3.5 years, 201 people, only 2 people have gone back into the system. And they have, there's a waiting list for their graduates. It's phenomenal. But in terms of humanizing, I think when you have a restaurant and the person who puts food on your plate, you know as an ex-offender, that's a humanizing act.
I think it's important to, for us as we move around the city of Chicago to think about how our neighborhoods are made because and around incarceration and policing. And I think that there's a way in which particularly white people can really distance themselves from all the things that that Kim and Tony were talking about so eloquently. There's a way that that white people can really perpetuate problems and distance themselves, and to think about where we live and how that's structured by incarceration, I think is pretty profound. Because I've been looking at long-term sentencing for a little while, I've thought a lot about how neighborhoods that I drive through to often get to Stateville are vacant. And the experience of vacancy is specifically because of sentencing. And so, I think that there's so many ways in which the criminal legal system crisscrosses our lives, but there's ways in which, spatially in the city of Chicago, people spatially don't often experience the impacts because we're so radically segregated in the city. So I think that even some initiatives like rent control that might seem like it's great for young people and people with student loans like me, those initiatives might seem not connected to something like the impact of policing and incarceration. I think that they really are. So it's such a huge web, and I think that having the conversation about something like rent control, or where you're going to send your kid to school, or how you get to the train or to the bus, actually can and should also be a conversation about incarceration or the criminal legal system and how it impacts us.
We have 4 great questions which are going to save Tony Preckwinkle from having to answer that politically difficult question about violent offenders and whether they need to get out too. No, you cleverly did not answer. But you're going to answer, I hope, and I hope someone on the panel will answer this question, which I've been asked on every single panel I've ever been on that addresses criminal justice, and bless you as an audience for wanting to know this, which is, what can we do? What can people do? What are the actionable steps that we can take? When we walk out of this room tonight, what can we do?
All right, so we're in the middle of an election process, okay? So, people are running for State House, they're running for the State Senate, they're running for Congress. I mean, make yourself aware of where your representatives are on these issues. And when you have an opportunity to talk to them or come to community forums, ask the question, what's your position on mandatory sentencing? What's your position on drug laws in this country? I mean, ordinary citizens have to be involved in the political process, otherwise we'll continue to have people in public office who believe that the worst thing you can say about somebody is that they're soft on crime, and that, the only way to be elected is to talk about the importance of locking people up for as long as possible. And that's the way we're going to make our communities safe, which of course is ridiculous. But we in this country have been willing to consume that pablum for a very long time. And unless ordinary citizens say, that's not where I am, that's not where I want you to be my elected representative, it's not going to change. The other thing you can do is, go work with the organizations that serve people who are returning citizens. Organizations like Safer Foundation or CARA, or organizations that work with youth that are challenged, like BUILD, for example, or Becoming a Man, Becoming a Woman, which are youth guidance I mean, there are all kinds of organizations that serve young people who are at risk. You know, go volunteer, help them raise money, help them provide programming, mentor somebody. I mean, there are a million opportunities for people who care about this. And I don't want anybody to think that this is such a depressing issue and it's such a terrible challenge, there's nothing I can do, because there are a million things you can do.
Visit a prison. Go to prison. Go to prison. Sarah can help you figure out a way to get into a prison. Go see it with your own eyes. You will never forget it. It will be an experience that will change your life. Go to prison.
But don't stay. But I think another just sort of thought experiment, I mean, we're in art school, I teach art, so I think about these things a lot, is really when you see, you know, crime reports on TV, or if you hear about something that's happened in your neighborhood that's bad, I'm thinking about how you can just ask yourself, how would we as a community solve that problem without putting people in a cage? How is that possible? I mean, we have to start someplace. We have to imagine that this is not the end result to solving harm. So I think that, you know, just as a thought experiment, to think about how we hold someone accountable, how do we deal with, you know, the problems that are in front of us without putting someone in a cage.
Okay, Angel is telling me, thank you, Sarah. Angel is telling me we only have 5 minutes left. We did start late, though, so I feel that's a little bit unfair. I'm going to ask the final 3 questions, and it's going to be a free-for-all. Y'all jump in and answer whichever one you want to. Some of them are hard. What are your thoughts about prison abolitionism? What is the impact of privatization of prisons? Does their success rely upon mass incarceration? And finally, this is a teeny-weeny little question. Can we have true criminal justice reform within a capitalist society? Violence is a symptom of poverty. Capitalism requires, you didn't write with big enough letters, capitalism requires a hierarchical structure which favors a few.
Let me just start out by saying one thing. Prison
Go for it.
can happen. You know, yeah, I just put it down. I'm sorry. Prison reform can happen, you know, so don't let anybody tell you it doesn't. And, you know, I would say one of the things you need to do is do your research. Right now, we're closing down for the first time federal prisons. That never happened before. But the state that is really leading the charge, and you would never guess it, is Texas. Look at what Texas is doing. They're shutting down some of their prisons. They're reforming their criminal justice system. And you would never think that. In 100 years, you would say, oh, it's Vermont or Connecticut. You know, it's Texas. Do your research. It could happen. So this is something that people can agree on. These are difficult times. I think at the federal level, it's a little bit harder. We have one senator, Senator Grassley, who's very conservative from Iowa, who wants to eliminate federal mandatory sentences. But our new, well, not so new Attorney General all of a sudden is throwing a monkey wrench into what has been a bipartisan effort to get rid of mandatory sentences, which all federal judges want to get rid of. You know, every single one that I've ever talked to in my 24 years on the bench wants them gone. And yet, politically, we're stuck with them. So I agree with President Preckwinkle. Do your research, find out who you're voting for, where they stand on some of these key issues. It's critical.
As the banker, I think I better jump into the defense of capitalism. I have never met a business owner, and I meet thousands of business owners each year, who wanted people in jail. They want productive employees. And productive employees can get paid more. So there is no bias. And in fact, if you look at the societies that have very high levels of incarceration, excepting the US, most of them are not capitalist societies. The low levels of incarceration, the places where people get re-entry, much more, get more engaged, are overwhelmingly capitalist societies.
We don't have any private prisons in Illinois. This is a problem elsewhere in the country, but it's not an issue here, and it's disgraceful because it creates an incentive to lock up more people. But fortunately, that's not one of our challenges.
private companies that are deeply entwined in the criminal justice system in other ways. They may not be private prisons, but they're private services that work in prisons that derive a profit from them.
Everything from, laundries to food service. Yes, that's quite true. However, I think it's entirely possible to continue to drive down jail and prison populations despite whatever lobbying those kind of vendors might do.
In fact,
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, in fact, the California Guards Union is a bigger lobbying body, probably, than private prison industries. California Prison Guards Union gives more money to the elections in California than most other, bodies. So,
I guess I'm not done defending capitalism. Sorry. But I do want to recognize Cook County for trying to harness it. There's a new procurement ordinance which all those folks who want to do business with the county and its multitude of entities, Cook County just initiated a way to try to drive positive social outcomes by giving a procurement pricing advantage to a number of different categories. One of those includes if 51% of the employees of a company or entity that's performing the service is comprised of employees who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, which includes ex-offenders. They get a pricing advantage. That's smart policy that uses capitalism in a very positive way.
So I guess I should be the person who talks about abolitionists. Oh no, you're not going to clap. Listen, I think the point that Judge Castillo made earlier is that we have to be nuanced in how we use prisons. And I think that there are some folks who, because of not just their acts, but there's some folks who, because of their acts, I should say, are not safe to be in our communities. And I say that as someone who has been the victim of violent crime. I've seen victims of violent crime. And if you talk to victims of violent crime, what they will tell you is not that they want someone to go away forever. They don't want that person to do the act again. But there is a small segment of our society who engages in behavior that does not make folks safe. And I think what we've done with our prison industry is perversely amplified who those folks are. But I don't know, and again, as we reimagine, and I'm certain open for conversation of how we make sure that those who have committed such egregious acts, and I say that from the vantage point of having seen some of the most awful things that you could ever imagine, and not wanting to be the prosecutor that comes and tells horror stories because we get good at that, but I've seen children, some of the most awful things done. And the value in their lives and what happened to them and what happens to their families matters. But I also know that there are some people who have done things, who have taken lives, who have come out of prisons and are some of the best advocates for policy. I had a guy speak on a panel, Eddie Bocanegra, who was convicted of a murder at 17 and is one of the most smart, talented men that I know. And so what I know is that he being locked up for the rest of his life didn't make sense. But I also know that we have to be able to figure out in this imagination what we do for those who have caused great harm. And I don't ever want to leave a conversation, even as I speak about reform and race and poverty, without saying that population is really small. But what we've done is we've taken that population and amplified it with everybody, so that there is no scalpel approach. There is this one size fit all, that we're treating people who do the most egregious crimes in the same way that we treat people who are battling addictions. And that's not right. And our system doesn't benefit from that. And that not everyone who has done an egregious crime is not worthy of reentry, but we haven't been thoughtful or nuanced in how to do that. So to the point that Tony didn't answer about violent offenders, we have to have a reckoning. And to the point that was made earlier, if the research and the data, which is why I'm a big data person, that 6 years versus 8 years, there is no difference in that too, stop asking for 8. If we know that young people age out of criminality, That between 17 and 24, you're volatile, but by the time you're 32 or 34, that you are less likely to engage in that behavior. If you look in our jails, there are younger people who are there who are engaged in this behavior. Why do I need to have you in there for 60 years? We need to have those conversations because there are things that we can do now that I think are short of abolition, that are smart, research-based, based on science and data that we have. We have to have the political will to say that it is not being soft on crime to ask for someone to have 10 years as opposed to 20, and say that that's not making you any less safe. In fact, it's making you safer.
Okay. Two things you can do as an audience. Keep caring about this issue. Read about this stuff. Read the Marshall Project, of course, please. Read anybody's stuff. Keep caring about this. Talk to other people. Tell them that you went to a panel about criminal justice and it wasn't just spinach, that it was interesting, informative, and inspiring. The second thing you can do is please join me in thanking this stellar panel for their comments.